Danielle Rivers knows the risks of a traffic stop. As a young, pregnant African-American woman, she's fully aware of the dangers her skin color and condition present. But when a routine encounter with Officer Turner quickly turns hostile, Danielle finds herself trapped in a nightmare. Alone and terrified, she must navigate the escalating situation with caution, knowing that one wrong move could be fatal for both her and her unborn child. Her only lifeline is her estranged brother, Jordan Rivers, rising politician known for his push for justice reform. Their relationship, fractured by years of unresolved grief and resentment, faces the ultimate test when he arrives at the scene. Jordan's influence could be the key to defusing the encounter, or the spark that ignites it further. The officer's past misconduct, Jordan's political ambitions, and the siblings' shared trauma intertwine in a dangerous standoff that could have life-altering consequences for them all. As tensions peak and the clock ticks, secrets long buried rise to the surface, threatening not only Jordan's career but the fragile bond he's trying to rebuild with his sister. In this story of justice, redemption, and the deep scars of systemic racism, can the Rivers siblings overcome their past and save each other, or will the night's events shatter them forever? The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban street. Danielle Rivers kept her eyes on the road, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. The distant hum of cicadas filled the air, mingling with the faint rumble of an engine behind her. Her pulse quickened when she glanced into the rearview mirror and saw the blue and red lights flashing. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Just another routine stop." She pulled over, her hands gripping the wheel as she watched the police cruiser park behind her. Danielle's mind raced. She hadn't been speeding, and her taillights were intact. She knew the risks of a traffic stop, especially as a black woman, and now, as a pregnant one, the stakes felt even higher. Officer Turner approached, his posture rigid and his hand resting near his holster. Danielle's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she watched him approach. She kept her expression neutral, her breath shallow. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "License and registration." Danielle nodded, her voice steady but soft. "Of course, officer." She reached slowly into her purse, retrieving her license, then leaned over to the glove compartment for the registration. She handed both to him, trying to keep her movements slow and deliberate. Turner examined the documents, his eyes flicking between her and the papers. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Danielle felt her pulse quicken. "I'm on my way home from a doctor's appointment." Turner's expression remained unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes that made Danielle's skin crawl. "Is that so?" As Turner continued to scrutinize her, Danielle felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew she was doing everything right, but something about the way he looked at her made her feel as if she'd already done something wrong. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he said, his tone sharp. Danielle blinked. "I'm sorry, officer, but is there a reason for this?" His eyes narrowed, and his hand drifted closer to his holster. "I said step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Danielle's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories like this. People pulled over for no reason, situations escalating into violence. She knew she had to tread carefully. Okay, she said, raising her hands slightly. "I'm complying." She unbuckled her seatbelt, the click echoing louder than it should have in the stillness of the street. As she opened the door and stepped out, she felt the weight of Turner's gaze on her, like he was waiting for her to make a wrong move. "Hands where I can see them," he instructed, and she complied, lifting her hands. The air felt thick, heavy with the tension between them. Danielle's heart pounded as she stood outside the car, feeling the cool air brush against her skin. Turner began inspecting the interior of her car, his eyes lingering on the sonogram picture clipped to the dashboard and the baby clothes folded neatly on the passenger seat. The longer he looked, the more uneasy she felt. Her phone was still in her hand, and she knew she needed help. She scrolled through her contacts, landing on a name she hadn't called in months, Jordan Rivers. Her brother. Despite everything that had happened between them, he was the only person she could think of. She pressed the call button, holding the phone close to her ear. It rang, each tone amplifying the fear gripping her chest. "Finally," he answered, his voice familiar but distant. Danielle? What's going on? Her voice trembled. Jordan, I'm pulled over. It's bad. He's acting aggressive. She could hear Jordan's breath catch. Where are you? Danielle gave him the street name, glancing at Turner, who was still rifling through her things. Please hurry. I'm on my way. Stay calm. Okay, he said, though she could hear the urgency in his voice. She hung up, feeling a mix of relief and dread. She knew Jordan would come, but she wasn't sure what would happen when he arrived. Turner slammed the car door shut, turning his attention back to Danielle. Who were you talking to? My brother, she said, trying to keep her voice even. I told him what's happening. Turner's eyes darkened. You think calling someone is going to change this situation? Danielle felt her frustration rising, but she forced herself to remain calm. I've done nothing wrong, officer. I'm just trying to go home. Turner's expression hardened. People like you think you can just cruise through any neighborhood like you own it? Danielle's anger flared, but she bit down on her tongue. People like me, she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the baton at his side. You heard me. Now, unless you want to make this a lot worse for yourself, I suggest you cooperate. Danielle's fear turned into a simmering anger. She knew she couldn't let this escalate, not when Jordan was on his way, but standing there, feeling the officer's hostility, made her blood boil. She glanced down at her belly, reminding herself what was at stake. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, the sound of an engine roared through the street. Danielle turned her head to see a sleek black car pull up, and relief washed over her when Jordan stepped out. Is there a problem here, officer? Jordan's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Turner's face tightened as he recognized Jordan. This is none of your business, Mr. Rivers. Jordan approached slowly, his hands raised slightly. That's my sister. I want to know why you pulled her over. Turner's posture stiffened. She was acting suspicious. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Suspicious? Or do you just have a problem with who's driving through this neighborhood? Turner's hand twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw it. You think you can use your position to intimidate me? Jordan's voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. I'm not trying to intimidate you, officer. I'm just making sure you understand that this isn't going unnoticed. Danielle watched the exchange, her heart racing. Seeing her brother again, standing up for her, made her emotions swirl. She felt a pang of guilt for the way they had left things, but right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was getting through this night safely. Turner's eyes darted between Danielle and Jordan. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down, but then he squared his shoulders. You're interfering with an active police investigation. Jordan didn't flinch. Or maybe I'm preventing you from making a mistake you'll regret. The standoff continued, the tension between the three of them palpable as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. Danielle knew that this was only the beginning of a long night, one that could change everything. The streetlights flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Jordan stood his ground, his gaze fixed on Officer Turner, who remained rigid, his hand still dangerously close to his holster. Danielle felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every muscle in her body tensed as she stood between the two men. Officer, you know as well as I do that you have no grounds for this stop, Jordan said, his voice calm but edged with steel. She wasn't speeding, and she's not breaking any laws. Let her go. Turner's eyes narrowed, his face a mask of controlled aggression. You think you know everything, don't you, Mr. Rivers? His voice was sharp, each word laced with disdain. Just because you've got that fancy title doesn't mean you run the show here. I'm not here to run anything, Jordan replied, taking a step closer. I'm here to protect my sister. Now, I suggest you de-escalate before this gets out of hand. Turner's lips curled into a sneer. De-escalate? The only one escalating this is you. Danielle felt her heart racing as she watched the tension mount between them. She could see the way Turner's posture shifted, how his fingers twitched. Jordan, please, she whispered, feeling the rising panic in her chest. Just, let's get out of here. Jordan glanced at her, his expression softening for a brief moment. I'm not going anywhere until this is right, Turner scoffed, his eyes flicking back and forth between the siblings. If you're so confident, then why don't you step back and let me do my job? I've seen your version of doing your job, Jordan retorted. And I've seen the consequences. I'm not leaving her alone. The officer's jaw tightened. The power struggle between the two men was becoming more visible, and Danielle knew they were walking a fine line. Danielle felt a surge of frustration building inside her. She was caught in the middle, watching as her brother and the officer squared off. The fear she felt earlier was now mingled with anger. Anger at being treated this way, and anger at Jordan for putting himself in harm's way when he could have simply left. Jordan, this isn't helping, she said, her voice louder, cutting through the tension. Why do you always have to make everything about you? Jordan's eyes snapped to her, a mixture of surprise and hurt flashing across his face. Danielle, I'm trying to protect you. Protect me, she scoffed, her voice rising. You're just making things worse. You're always so focused on being the hero, but where were you when I needed you before? Turner's eyes flicked between them, sensing an opportunity. See? Even your own sister thinks you're out of line, Mr. Rivers. Maybe you should listen to her. Jordan ignored him, his focus remaining on Danielle. I left to make things better, Danielle, to change the system that failed us. You know that. Danielle's face tightened, and she folded her arms over her chest. All I know is that you left me and Mom to fend for ourselves while you ran off to be the city's savior. Jordan's shoulders sagged, the weight of her words settling over him. I know I messed up, okay? But I'm here now, and I'm not letting this happen again. The raw emotion between them was palpable, and Turner took a step back, his smirk growing as he watched their argument unfold. He saw a crack in their unity and was ready to exploit it. As the argument continued, Danielle felt her control slipping. Her hands shook, and tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for the baby she was carrying. Jordan, you always say you're here to help, but you only show up when it's convenient for you, she accused, her voice cracking. You left, and you can't just walk back into my life and pretend everything's okay. Jordan's expression softened, a look of regret crossing his face. I know I left, and I know it hurt you, but this is different. How is it different? She cut him off. You think just because you've got some influence now, everything will be fine? Turner watched the exchange with satisfaction, his arms crossed. Family drama? Huh? Well, maybe it's time for Mr. Rivers here to back off and let me do my job. Danielle clenched her fists, her voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't about you, Jordan. It's about me, and it's about him. She gestured towards Turner. And you're just giving him more reason to make this worse. Jordan's eyes softened as he took in her words. I'm sorry, Danielle. I didn't mean to make things harder. I can't stand by and let this happen. Danielle looked away, her gaze falling to the ground. Just stop arguing with him. Please. For once, don't make it about proving a point. Turner's face lit up with a twisted sense of satisfaction as he saw the siblings at odds. See? Even she knows you're in over your head. Now, why don't you take your political act somewhere else before I charge you both with obstruction? Jordan's eyes flicked to Danielle, then back to Turner. You know you have no grounds to make an arrest. Maybe, Turner said with a smirk, but I'm sure I could find something if you keep pushing. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping low. Or I could just take her in and figure it out later. Danielle felt a chill run down her spine, and she instinctively stepped closer to Jordan, seeking the protection she had resisted only moments before. Jordan, please. Let's just go. Jordan clenched his jaw, torn between backing down and protecting his sister. His mind raced. He knew Turner was baiting him, trying to provoke him into making a mistake. But every fiber of his being screamed at him not to leave her alone. Okay, he said finally, his voice tight. We'll go. Turner's smirk widened. Smart choice. Danielle's shoulders sagged in relief, but as she moved to return to her car, Turner grabbed her arm. Not so fast. Jordan's eyes flared with anger. What are you doing? Just making sure we're clear, Turner said, holding Danielle's gaze. You people need to learn your place. Danielle pulled her arm free, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I know my place, officer. And it's not here. Dealing with this. The backup police cars arrived, their flashing lights casting a harsh glow over the scene. Turner straightened, his posture defensive as he saw the other officers step out. Jordan watched the backup arrive, and a sense of determination filled him. I know these officers, Turner. If you want to make this official, we can settle it right here. Turner's eyes flicked nervously to the approaching officers. This isn't over, he muttered, backing away slightly. You're not as untouchable as you think, Rivers. Danielle, seeing the other officers, felt a brief surge of hope. She stood by Jordan, a small gesture that showed she trusted him, despite everything. Jordan, let's just go. Jordan placed a hand on her shoulder. We will, but not until we're safe. He turned to the backup officers. I want it noted that this stop had no legitimate cause. One of the officers stepped forward, his face stern as he glanced between Turner and Jordan. Mr. Rivers, is there a problem here? There was, Jordan replied, his voice calm but authoritative. But I think we've resolved it. Turner's face flushed, but he said nothing. The backup officers exchanged glances before one of them nodded. Understood. If that's the case, you and your sister are free to go. Danielle exhaled, the weight of the night's events still heavy on her shoulders. She looked up at Jordan, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Jordan's expression softened. I told you, Danielle. I'm not leaving you again. As they walked back to the car, Turner watched them with a cold glare. I'll be watching, Rivers. Both of you. Jordan didn't look back. We'll be watching, too. The siblings climbed into the car, and as Danielle started the engine, she glanced at Jordan. I'm still mad at you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jordan nodded. I know, but I'm not giving up on making things right. As they drove off, the tension between them remained, but something had shifted. The events of the night had forced them to confront their past, and while the rift was still there, it no longer felt as insurmountable. They had survived this night together, and that was a start. The air felt electric as Danielle stood her ground, the evening shadows casting long lines across the street. She could feel every eye on her, Turner's, Jordan's, the small crowd that had started to gather, but she refused to shrink. She had reached a breaking point. No, she said, her voice firm. I'm not going anywhere until you explain why you stopped me. Turner's eyes flashed with irritation. Ma'am, you need to comply with. No, she interrupted, louder this time. I know my rights. She took a breath, steadying herself. I'm not a threat, and you have no reason to keep me here. Jordan watched her, a mix of pride and concern in his eyes. Danielle, maybe we should. No, Jordan. Her eyes stayed locked on Turner's. I've had enough. Dad always said to stand up for what's right, and I won't let this happen again. Turner's expression tightened at the mention of their father. And how did that work out for him? He sneered. Danielle felt the words hit like a punch to the gut, but she didn't waver. She knew Turner was trying to provoke her, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Our father was a good man, and what happened to him wasn't justice. Jordan stepped closer to her side, his presence a quiet support. Turner's smirk vanished, replaced with a hardened glare. I don't care about your family history, he snapped. What matters is that you do what I say, or I'll make sure you regret it. Jordan, sensing the shift in Turner's demeanor, seized the moment. You know, Turner, I remember when you were investigated a few years back. Excessive force complaints, wasn't it? Turner's face darkened. Those were dismissed, he said through clenched teeth. You think you can intimidate me with that? Danielle's eyes widened as she realized the connection. You knew him before tonight? Jordan nodded. Yeah, I knew him. I was part of the team that pushed for the investigation. He turned back to Turner. And I know how you operate. I've seen the complaints. Turner's eyes flicked to the backup officers, who were watching the exchange with uncertainty. You think you can dig up my past and use it against me? He hissed. This isn't some political rally where you get to preach about reform. Jordan crossed his arms, his stance unwavering. This isn't about politics. This is about accountability. The tension between them was palpable, and Danielle could feel the unease building in the air. She glanced at the backup officers, noticing the uncertainty on their faces. Turner's authority was slipping, and Jordan knew it. As the argument between Turner and Jordan intensified, Danielle felt a rush of emotions she could no longer contain. "You were part of that investigation?" she asked Jordan, her voice tight. "You never told me." Jordan's eyes softened, and he looked away. "I was trying to protect you, Danielle. You were dealing with enough after Dad." "Don't." She cut him off, her voice trembling. "Don't use that as an excuse. You left, Jordan. You left me and Mom when we needed you most." Turner watched the exchange, a cold satisfaction creeping into his expression. "Sounds like family issues to me," he taunted. "Maybe you should have a nice, long chat somewhere else." Danielle ignored him, her focus on Jordan. "You act like you're here to save me now, but where were you when things fell apart? When Mom couldn't pay the bills? When I had to drop everything to take care of her?" Jordan's jaw tightened, guilt flashing across his face. "I know I left, and I know I made mistakes, but I thought I could make things better if I had a platform, a way to fight back." Danielle's hands shook, her anger and pain bubbling to the surface. "You think speeches and policies make up for abandoning your family? You think being a politician gives you the right to act like a hero?" Jordan's face fell, the weight of her words hitting him hard. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I thought if I could change things, it would mean something." "It doesn't change anything," Danielle whispered, the pain evident in her eyes. Turner, sensing the tension between the siblings, decided to make his move. "Enough of this," he said, his voice sharp. He turned to the backup officers. "We're taking her in." Danielle's eyes widened. "On what grounds?" Turner shrugged. "Obstruction, resisting, whatever I decide." He stepped closer to the backup officers, his tone commanding. "Get her in the car." One of the backup officers hesitated, glancing at Jordan. "Sir, I don't think we have grounds to." "Are you questioning me?" Turner barked. "I gave an order." Jordan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You know this is wrong, Turner. You're pushing your authority, and they see it." Turner's eyes flashed with anger. "And you're interfering with a police investigation. Step back or you're both coming in." Danielle felt the fear creeping back in. She knew Turner was bluffing, trying to regain control, but she also knew how easily things could spiral. "Jordan, please." "No, Danielle," Jordan said, his gaze fixed on Turner. "He's trying to scare us, but we're not backing down." The backup officers exchanged uneasy glances, and Turner's frustration grew. "Fine. We'll see how you handle this when things escalate." Just as Turner was about to issue another command, more police cars pulled up, and the street was filled with the flashing lights of reinforcements. Danielle's heart raced as she watched the new arrivals. The tension in the air thickened, the crowd around them whispering and pointing. Turner squared his shoulders, trying to reclaim his authority. "You all control the crowd. We've got a situation here." Jordan stepped forward, his voice loud enough for the crowd and the officers to hear. "We've been standing here peacefully, and my sister has done nothing wrong. This officer is abusing his power." One of the newly arrived officers, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, approached. "What's going on here?" Turner opened his mouth to respond, but Jordan spoke first. "My name is Jordan Rivers. This is my sister, Danielle." Officer Turner pulled her over without cause, and now he's escalating the situation without any justification. The new officer's eyes flicked between Turner and Jordan. "Mr. Rivers, I know who you are," he said, his tone respectful but cautious. "Let's all take a step back and de-escalate." Turner's face turned red. "We don't need to de-escalate anything. This man is interfering with police business." The officer looked at Turner, his expression stern. "We need to proceed by the book, Turner. No one's interfering. Let's get this resolved properly." Danielle felt a wave of relief as the officer's words signaled a shift in the power dynamic. Turner's grip on the situation was loosening, and she could feel the crowd's support growing. As the officers began speaking among themselves, Jordan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get through this, Danielle. Together." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Danielle allowed herself to believe that might be true. She nodded, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. Just don't leave again. Jordan squeezed her shoulder. I'm not going anywhere. Turner, watching the scene unfold, knew he was losing control. His eyes darted to the crowd, then back to the officers. He clenched his fists, the realization of his waning authority settling over him. The night wasn't over yet, but the balance of power had begun to shift, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers. The crowd had grown thicker, a mix of curious onlookers and concerned neighbors, their murmurs filling the air as tension simmered between Turner, Jordan, and Danielle. The flashing blue and red lights painted the scene in a surreal, almost otherworldly glow. Turner's face was a mask of frustration as he turned to the backup officers. This woman is resisting, and Mr. Rivers here is interfering with a police investigation. We need to detain them both. One of the backup officers, a younger man with a hesitant expression, exchanged a glance with his partner. Officer Turner, are you sure this is necessary? Turner's eyes flared. Are you questioning my authority? Jordan stepped forward, placing himself between Turner and Danielle. This isn't about authority, Turner. It's about your misuse of it. He raised his voice, making sure the crowd and the officers could hear him. My sister did nothing wrong, and you're escalating the situation without cause. Danielle watched the exchange, her heart pounding. She knew her brother was taking a risk, challenging Turner's authority like that, but she also felt a flicker of hope as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some people started recording the scene on their phones, and the backup officers looked increasingly uneasy. Turner's hand twitched near his belt. I'm warning you, Rivers. Step back. Jordan held his ground, his eyes locked on Turner's. No, not this time. The tension was palpable, a silent standoff where any wrong move could set everything off. Jordan, sensing the moment was critical, turned to the crowd. Everyone here can see what's happening, he called out. This is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern, and it needs to stop. The crowd's response was immediate. Some shouted in support, others murmured in agreement. The younger officer seemed to waver, his eyes darting between Turner and Jordan. Danielle stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. Please, we just want to go home, she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. This isn't about breaking the law. It's about justice. Turner's expression hardened. Don't play the victim here, he spat. You people always. Jordan's eyes flashed with anger, and he cut Turner off. Stop. He pointed at Turner, then addressed the crowd. This is what we're fighting against. A system that abuses its power, that targets people based on their skin color. His voice rose, filled with passion. And we can't stay silent. Danielle felt tears prick her eyes. Seeing Jordan speak out, putting everything on the line, brought a swell of emotion she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, she felt a connection to him that she thought was long gone. The crowd's support grew, with more people voicing their concerns and questioning Turner's actions. Turner's grip on the situation was slipping, and the backup officers exchanged uncertain glances. Turner, sensing the shift, leaned closer to the younger officer, his voice low but forceful. You can't let him sway you. He's using his position to manipulate the situation. The young officer hesitated, clearly torn. But sir, we have no evidence of a crime. She's cooperating, and the crowd? Forget the crowd, Turner snapped, his eyes blazing. If we let them dictate how we do our job, we've already lost. Jordan, watching the exchange, took a deep breath and stepped forward. Turner, you're out of line. You know this isn't right. Turner's face twisted with rage. You don't get to tell me how to do my job, Rivers. You think your political connections will protect you forever? Danielle, seeing the desperation in Turner's eyes, felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew how dangerous it was when someone like him felt cornered. Jordan, be careful, she whispered. Jordan glanced back at her, his expression determined. I'm not afraid of him. Turner's hand hovered over his taser, and for a moment, it looked like he might make a move. The crowd watched with bated breath, and Danielle's heart raced. She knew they were on the edge of something dangerous, and the balance of power was teetering. Danielle took a deep breath, feeling a surge of resolve. She had to speak up, not just for herself but for everyone watching. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on Turner. "You've made this about power, not the law," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "And I'm not going to stay silent." She turned to the crowd, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't the first time my family has faced this kind of injustice. My father," her voice caught, but she pushed through. "He was taken from us because of abuse like this, and it has to stop." The crowd's response was immediate. Voices called out in support, and people raised their phones higher, capturing every word. Danielle felt a rush of energy, the fear that had gripped her chest slowly transforming into something more powerful, determination. Jordan watched her, pride shining in his eyes. "Danielle's right," he said. "This isn't just about us. It's about every person who's been targeted, harassed, or worse, for nothing more than the color of their skin." Turner's face turned red, his authority slipping away with every word. "You think this is a game?" he shouted, but the crowd's noise drowned him out. Danielle felt the power shift, the crowd's support emboldening her. One of the backup officers finally stepped forward. "Sir, I think we need to step back and assess the situation. This is getting out of control." Turner's eyes blazed with fury. "You're siding with them?" The backup officer hesitated, his eyes meeting Danielle's for a moment. "I'm saying we need to follow protocol, and this doesn't feel right." Turner's face twisted in rage. "Protocol? They're making a mockery of us. We need to regain control." But the crowd was no longer listening to Turner. They were listening to Danielle and Jordan. More people were speaking up, demanding answers, and questioning the legitimacy of the stop. The young officer turned back to Turner. "We need to do this by the book, sir." Danielle's heart soared. She felt the tide turning, felt the power of the crowd's support lifting her up. She glanced at Jordan, who nodded. They were united, standing together. Turner, seeing his authority slipping further, lashed out. "Enough!" he shouted, reaching for his taser. "I will not be undermined." But just as he moved, one of the backup officers stepped in, placing a hand on his arm. "That's enough, Turner. We're ending this." Turner's eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing?" The officer's face was firm. "We're not escalating this any further. It's over." The crowd erupted in support, their voices rising as Turner stood there, his authority shattered. Danielle felt a weight lift off her shoulders, and she turned to Jordan, relief and gratitude in her eyes. "We did it." Jordan nodded, his expression serious but relieved. "It's not over yet, but this is a start." As the officers finally stepped back, allowing Danielle and Jordan to leave, the crowd cheered, their voices echoing in the night. Danielle felt a rush of hope. For the first time, she believed that change was possible. The atmosphere on the street was electric, the crowd's voices a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. Turner's face was flushed with frustration as he grabbed Danielle's arm, his grip tight and unyielding. Danielle struggled against him, her heart racing. "Let go of me," she shouted, her voice cracking. Jordan, seeing his sister in distress, rushed forward. "Get your hands off her." He shoved Turner, forcing him to release Danielle. Turner stumbled but quickly recovered, his eyes blazing with fury. "This is obstruction," Turner yelled, his hand going to his baton. "Back off, or you're going down too." Jordan stepped between Turner and Danielle, his hands raised. "I won't let you hurt her." Turner's face twisted in rage. "You think you can save her, Rivers? You think you can walk in here and just take control?" Danielle felt a surge of fear as Turner drew his baton. The crowd gasped, and people began to shout, some pleading for calm, others calling for justice. She clung to Jordan's arm, feeling the panic rise in her chest. "Jordan, please. It's not worth it." Jordan's gaze was fixed on Turner. "You need to let this go, Turner. You're outnumbered and you're out of line." The backup officers stood frozen, their eyes shifting between Turner and Jordan. The younger officer from earlier, clearly conflicted, took a step forward. "Officer Turner, maybe we should reconsider. There's no need for this to escalate." Turner glared at him, his knuckles white as he gripped his baton. This is insubordination, Jenkins. You want to join them in cuffs? Jenkins hesitated, his gaze lingering on Danielle's frightened expression. He glanced at the crowd, then at Jordan. Sir, they're unarmed, and the crowd's getting restless. We should defuse the situation. Jordan met Jenkins's eyes, sensing the young officer's internal struggle. Jenkins, you know this isn't right. Stand with us. Turner's eyes flashed with fury. You're making a big mistake, Jenkins. But Jenkins took a deep breath and stepped closer to Danielle and Jordan. No, sir. I think we need to back off. The crowd erupted in cheers, some chanting Jenkins's name, while others shouted encouragement. Turner's face turned crimson, the veins in his neck bulging. You'll regret this, he hissed, his voice barely audible over the noise. Jordan seized the moment, his voice cutting through the chaos. Turner, this is your last chance. Put the baton down and walk away, or face the consequences. Turner's hand trembled, and for a moment, it looked like he might listen. But then, with a desperate look in his eyes, he reached for his gun. I'm not backing down. Danielle's breath caught in her throat as she saw the weapon. Jordan. No. Jordan stood firm, his hands raised. Turner, think about what you're doing. This won't end well for you. Turner's grip tightened, and the tension in the air became unbearable. The crowd's voices grew louder, some pleading, others shouting in anger. Danielle felt her heart race, every muscle in her body screaming for her to run, but she couldn't leave Jordan. Jenkins stepped between them, his hand outstretched. Sir, put the weapon down. We can resolve this peacefully. Turner's eyes darted between Jordan, Danielle, and Jenkins. You think this is a game? He growled. I've had enough of you people telling me how to do my job. The moment stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity. Turner's hand wavered, and in the confusion, a single shot rang out. The crowd screamed and scattered, panic rippling through the onlookers like a shockwave. Danielle flinched, instinctively ducking. Her heart pounded as she searched for Jordan, fearing the worst. Jordan! She cried out, her voice breaking. Jordan stumbled, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. I'm okay. It's just a graze, he said, his voice strained. Turner stood frozen, his gun still raised, the look of shock on his face mirroring the horror in Danielle's eyes. The backup officers moved in, shouting orders, their guns drawn. Jenkins lunged forward, knocking the weapon from Turner's hand. That's enough, Turner. Danielle rushed to Jordan's side, her hands shaking as she pressed them over his wound. You're bleeding. Oh my God, Jordan, you're bleeding. He winced but forced a smile. It's nothing, just stay calm. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Turner was wrestled to the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back. The officers dragged him away, his shouts fading into the background noise. Danielle's hands shook as she looked up at the people around her, seeing the fear and anger etched on their faces. As the chaos began to settle, the street transformed into a scene of controlled tension. Medics arrived to tend to Jordan's wound, and the police cordoned off the area, trying to regain order. Danielle sat beside Jordan, her hands stained with his blood. I thought. She choked on her words, tears welling up. I thought I was going to lose you. Jordan reached out, squeezing her hand. You didn't. I'm right here. She wiped her eyes, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on her. Why did it have to be like this? Jordan sighed, leaning back against the ambulance. Because change doesn't come easy. And some people will do anything to hold on to power, even if it means hurting others. Danielle looked out at the crowd, the faces of strangers who had stood up for her and Jordan. But we're not alone. No, we're not, Jordan agreed. And that's what matters. As the medics continued their work, one of the officers approached. Mr. Rivers, Ms. Rivers, we need to take your statements. Danielle nodded, feeling the exhaustion seep into her bones. We'll do whatever we need to. Jordan squeezed her hand again. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to us and not to anyone else. Danielle looked at her brother, the anger and pain she had carried for so long starting to melt away. Together? Jordan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Together. The night had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but they had faced it side by side. And as the police began their investigation, Danielle felt a spark of hope. Hope that this was the beginning of a new chapter for her and Jordan, one where they could fight for justice, not just as siblings, but as partners. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. Danielle watched as Turner was loaded into a patrol car, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. She knew this wasn't the end, but it was a start, a reckoning that would echo beyond this one night. The cold, sterile lighting of the police precinct contrasted sharply with the chaos of the night before. Danielle and Jordan sat side by side in the waiting area, the tension between them softened by the shared experience. Both were exhausted, their eyes reflecting the weight of the night's events. A detective from Internal Affairs, a woman with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor, approached them. "Mr. Rivers, Ms. Rivers, thank you for coming in. We're conducting a full investigation into Officer Turner's conduct." Jordan nodded, his expression serious. "We're ready to give our statements." Danielle looked at her brother, seeing the determination in his eyes. For the first time in years, she felt they were truly united. "This is about making sure this doesn't happen again," she said softly. The detective led them into a small interview room. The walls were bare, the only sounds the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. As they recounted the events of the night, the tension in the air was palpable, each detail a reminder of how close things had come to tragedy. After the interview, the detective gave them a nod. "We appreciate your cooperation. We'll be in touch." As they left the precinct, Danielle paused. "Jordan, thank you for being there." He met her eyes. "I should have been there all along. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Outside the precinct, a crowd had gathered. The media's cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions. Protesters held signs, their voices rising in chants demanding justice. The incident had become a flashpoint, and Danielle felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Jordan squeezed her hand. "This is bigger than us now." They stepped forward, and the crowd quieted as Jordan began to speak. "Last night, my sister and I faced an abuse of power. But this isn't just our story. It's the story of many people who have been targeted and harassed for no reason other than the color of their skin." Danielle took a deep breath, her voice steady as she added, "We can't let fear silence us. We have to stand together, as a community, and demand accountability." The crowd erupted in applause, and the energy was electric. As the media captured the moment, Danielle felt a sense of purpose growing within her. For the first time, she saw how her and Jordan's experiences could create real change. Back at her apartment, Danielle sat on her couch, the events of the night replaying in her mind. The fear, the anger, and finally, the hope. She held the sonogram picture of her baby, thinking about the future she wanted to build. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She opened it to find Jordan standing there, looking hesitant. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside, letting him enter. "Of course." He took a seat across from her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking. We can't just let this end with Turner's investigation. There are too many people out there who face the same thing." Danielle nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing." She looked at him, a smile playing on her lips. "Maybe we should do something about it. Together." Jordan's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You mean it?" She nodded. "Yes. I can't change what happened before, but I want to be part of something that makes a difference." They shared a look of understanding, the years of hurt and separation beginning to fade. "Then let's do it," Jordan said. "We'll fight for justice, for Dad, and for everyone who needs us." The sun shone brightly over the park where a rally was taking place. Danielle and Jordan stood at the podium, facing a crowd of hundreds. Their story had ignited a movement, and the community had come together, determined to hold the system accountable. Danielle took the microphone, her voice steady. "I never thought I'd be standing here, speaking to all of you. But last night, something changed. I realized that staying silent means accepting injustice. And I can't do that anymore." The crowd cheered, their energy palpable. She handed the microphone to Jordan. "We're here to make sure that no one else has to live in fear," he said. "We're demanding reform, and we won't stop until it happens." The rally continued, with speakers from the community sharing their own stories. Danielle felt the strength of the people around her, their collective power a force for change. She glanced at Jordan, and he gave her a nod, his expression one of pride. In that moment, she knew they were on the right path. A few weeks later, Danielle stood in Jordan's office, the city skyline stretching out beyond the window. The room was filled with boxes and papers, evidence of the work they'd started together. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, and a sense of hope hung between them. Jordan looked up from his desk as she entered. "Ready for our next step?" She smiled. More than ready. They discussed plans for a community outreach program designed to educate and empower others who had faced similar injustices. It was a daunting task, but Danielle felt a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. "Together, we can make a difference," Jordan said, his voice full of conviction. Danielle nodded. "And we'll make sure no one else has to go through what we did." As they worked, the bond between them strengthened. They weren't just siblings anymore. They were partners in a mission, united by their past and determined to build a better future. The city outside buzzed with life, a reminder that the world was full of challenges, but also full of possibility. Danielle felt a spark of hope. They had faced the storm together, and now they were moving forward, stronger than ever.